Three crosses stood against the darkening sky. The wind moved slowly over the hill called Golgotha. Soldiers laughed. Crowds shouted. Some watched with curiosity. Others watched with satisfaction. Because on those crosses, justice was being carried out. Two criminals hung beside the man in the center. Both had lived lives filled with violence, theft, and rebellion. Both had been condemned by the Roman authorities. Both were dying. But only one of them would leave that hill with something no court on earth could ever give: mercy. The man on the left cursed the pain. He spat words through cracked lips. "Aren't you the Messiah?" he shouted toward the man beside him. "Save yourself and save us." To him, the cross was nothing but humiliation, nothing but failure. But the other criminal was watching something different. He watched the man in the center, the one the crowd mocked, the one bleeding beneath a crown of thorns, the one who, instead of cursing his executioners, prayed for them. "Father, forgive them." The criminal felt something strange stir inside him. All his life, he had seen power used for violence. But never like this. Never power wrapped in mercy. And suddenly, in the final moments of his life, he understood something the crowd could not see. The man beside him was not just another victim. He was a king. And so the dying criminal turned his head with the last strength left in his body. And he spoke the most desperate prayer a man could ever whisper: "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." The hill went silent for a moment, and the answer he received would become one of the most powerful promises ever spoken. "Today, you will be with me in paradise." Long before that final afternoon on a hill outside Jerusalem, before the crowd mocked, before the soldiers lifted the crosses into the burning sky, before the condemned criminal turned his head and spoke the words that would echo through eternity, there was a boy no one would have imagined dying beside the Jesus Christ. He was not born a criminal. He was not born with violence in his heart. Like every child in Judea, he began life with ordinary hopes. He ran barefoot through dusty streets. He laughed with other boys beside the wells. He watched caravans pass the village road and dreamed of traveling the world beyond the hills. His mother would sometimes call him in before sunset. "Come inside. The soldiers will pass soon." Because in those days, Judea lived under the heavy shadow of Roman Empire rule. Roman banners hung over city gates. Roman taxes crushed poor families. Roman soldiers patrolled the streets like reminders that Israel was no longer free. Children grew up learning two truths very early. Rome had power, and ordinary people had none. The boy watched his father struggle every season. Harvests were small. Taxes were large. Sometimes collectors arrived before the grain was even gathered. Coins disappeared. Food became scarce. One evening, the boy heard his father arguing with a tax collector in the courtyard. "We cannot pay this." "You must. My children will starve." "That is not Rome's concern." The boy watched as soldiers took their last sacks of grain. That night his father sat silently in the corner of their home. Something inside the boy hardened. The world was not fair. Power belonged to the ruthless, and the weak simply suffered. Years passed. The boy grew into a young man, but the bitterness inside him grew faster. Around Judea, rebellion whispered in the shadows. Men gathered in secret places. They spoke of overthrowing Rome, of taking back the land God had promised Israel, of fighting instead of submitting. To a young man filled with anger, those words sounded like justice. At first, he only listened. Then he joined them. The group he fell in with was not made of noble heroes like the stories of ancient Israel. They were desperate men. Some were rebels. Some were thieves. Some were simply men who had nothing left to lose. Their leader spoke boldly. "Rome calls us criminals, but we are freedom fighters." They attacked Roman supply caravans. They robbed wealthy travelers loyal to Rome. They raided villages that cooperated with the empire. At first, the young man believed he was fighting for justice. But slowly the line between justice and greed disappeared. Coins filled his pockets. Violence became normal. Fear became a tool. Villagers whispered his name with dread. The boy who once dreamed beside the village wall had become something else. A bandit. A criminal. A man the authorities hunted. But there was another man in their group. A partner in crime. Another thief. The two of them often rode together on raids, shared stolen food by campfires, and laughed at the soldiers who chased them through the desert roads. Neither of them imagined where their paths would end. But Rome was patient, and Rome was ruthless. One night the soldiers finally caught them. The arrest was swift. Torches cut through the darkness. Swords flashed. Horses surrounded their camp before they could escape. The criminals fought back, but it was hopeless. Iron chains closed around their wrists. They were dragged to prison like animals. Their crimes were not small. The Romans did not waste time with long trials. Bandits who threatened Roman order received only one sentence: crucifixion, the slowest, most humiliating, most terrifying execution in the ancient world. Word of their sentence spread quickly through Jerusalem. Some people felt relief. Others felt curiosity. Crucifixions were public warnings. Rome displayed them where everyone could see. As the day of execution approached, the two criminals sat in their dark prison cell. One of them cursed the guards. He cursed Rome. He cursed the world. But the other thief, the one whose story would be remembered forever, sat quietly in the corner. For the first time in years, the noise of violence had stopped. And in the silence, something uncomfortable began to rise in his mind. Memories. His mother calling him home before sunset. His father's tired face. The boy he used to be. He realized something painful. Every choice had brought him here. Every act of violence. Every stolen coin. Every moment he believed power would fill the emptiness inside him. Now he was days away from death, and nothing he had taken mattered anymore. Outside the prison walls, the city buzzed with rumors. Because at the same time another man had been arrested. A teacher. A miracle worker. A man many people called the Messiah. His name was Jesus Christ. Some said he healed the blind. Others said he raised the dead. Still others claimed he spoke about a kingdom not of this world. The prisoner heard the guards talking about him. That man from Galilee is being executed tomorrow. The one they call the King of the Jews? Yes. The thief listened quietly. He had never met this teacher. He had never heard his sermons. Their lives had been completely different. One walked through villages healing people. The other terrorized roads stealing from them. And yet, by a strange twist of fate, both of them would soon walk the same road. The road to the cross. The sun rose the next morning over Jerusalem. Soldiers opened the prison doors. Chains rattled. Get up. It was time. The criminals were dragged into the streets where crowds had already begun gathering. Roman executions were not private. They were spectacles, warnings to anyone who dared challenge the empire. Wooden crossbeams were forced onto the prisoners' shoulders. The heavy weight pressed into their backs. The march toward the hill began. Somewhere ahead of them walked another condemned man. A man beaten and bleeding. A crown of thorns pressed into his head. The crowd shouted insults. Look at the King of the Jews. The thief lifted his eyes and saw him for the first time. The man called Jesus Christ. He looked different from the criminals. Not defiant. Not violent. Not bitter. There was pain in his face. But there was also something else. A strange calm. A quiet authority. The thief did not understand it. But something about that moment unsettled him. The march continued up the rocky hill known as Golgotha. 3 crosses waited. 1 for the teacher. 2 for the criminals. By midday, all 3 would hang between heaven and earth. And on that hill, one dying man would make the most important decision of his life. Not years before, not months before, but in the final hours before death. A decision that would open the gates of paradise. The sky had begun to change. At first, people thought it was just clouds. But the darkness grew, slowly swallowing the light of the afternoon. The air became heavier. The laughter of the crowd faded into uneasy murmurs. Something about this moment felt different. The criminal hanging beside Jesus felt it too. His breathing had become shallow. Every movement of his chest sent waves of pain through his body. Sweat mixed with blood ran down his face. He knew his time was running out. Every second on that cross felt longer than the last. Beside him, the other criminal continued shouting insults. Save yourself. And save us too if you are really the Messiah. The crowd laughed again, encouraged by the mockery. But the first thief, the one who had spoken earlier, had grown quiet. He was watching Jesus. Not casually, carefully, closely, trying to understand something his heart could barely grasp. Jesus had been beaten, whipped, mocked, crowned with thorns, and nailed to wood. Yet he had not cursed anyone. Not once. Instead, something happened that shook the criminal to his core. Jesus spoke, not to defend himself, not to condemn his enemies, but to pray. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. The thief froze. Forgive them? Forgive the men who had just nailed his hands to the cross? Forgive the soldiers who mocked him? Forgive the crowd screaming for his death? This was not normal. This was not human. The criminal felt something crack open inside his heart. His entire life had been built on survival. Steal before someone steals from you. Hurt before someone hurts you. Trust no one. But here was a man, dying unjustly, choosing mercy. And suddenly the thief realized something terrifying and beautiful at the same time. This man was different. Different from every leader. Different from every priest. Different from every king. The thief looked again at the wooden sign above Jesus' head. King of the Jews. The soldiers had placed it there to mock him. But what if? What if it was true? Another wave of pain shot through his body. His vision blurred. Memories flooded his mind. The first theft. The first lie. The first time he ignored his conscience. Years of crime. Years of running. Years of becoming someone he never meant to be. Now it all ended here. On a cross. Exactly where criminals like him belonged. But Jesus did not belong here. Even the Roman governor had said he found no fault in him. The thief looked again at the other criminal who was still mocking Jesus. Something inside him snapped. "Don't you fear God?" he shouted. The words surprised even him. The crowd fell momentarily silent. "We are punished justly," he continued, his voice trembling from exhaustion. "We are getting what our deeds deserve." His breathing grew heavier. Then he looked at Jesus again. "But this man has done nothing wrong." In that moment, something changed. For the first time in his life, the thief stopped blaming others. He stopped pretending. He stopped hiding. He admitted the truth. He was guilty. And somehow, that honesty opened a door in his soul. Because when a person finally stops pretending, they become ready for grace. The thief turned his head toward Jesus. His voice was weaker now, but his words carried more courage than anything he had ever said before. Jesus. He used his name. Not king. Not prophet. Just Jesus. Like someone speaking to a friend. "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." It was the strangest prayer ever spoken. He did not ask to be saved from the cross. He did not ask for his pain to end. He did not even ask for forgiveness directly. He simply asked, "Remember me," as if he believed that somewhere beyond this death, beyond this suffering, Jesus would still be king. And if that kingdom truly existed, maybe there was a place for someone like him. Even a thief. Even a criminal. Even a man who had wasted his entire life. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The wind moved across the hill. The crowd waited. And Jesus turned his head, bruised, bleeding, barely able to breathe. Yet his eyes met the eyes of the dying criminal. And what Jesus said next would become one of the most powerful promises ever spoken in human history. But the crowd had no idea. They were about to witness something shocking. Because in just a few words, a lifetime of sin was about to collide with limitless mercy. For a brief moment, everything felt still. The wind slowed. The voices of the crowd faded into a distant blur. The thief waited. He did not expect much. Maybe silence. Maybe rejection. After all, why would a holy man respond to someone like him? He had lived a life full of crime, lies, and violence. His name had never been spoken with honor. No priest would have welcomed him. No synagogue would have trusted him. And now it was too late to change anything. His hands were nailed to wood. His past could not be undone. His future seemed to end within the next few painful hours. All he had asked for was to be remembered. But what happened next shattered every expectation. Jesus turned his head slowly toward the thief. Blood ran down his face from the crown of thorns pressed into his scalp. His breathing was labored. Each word cost him strength. Yet when he spoke, his voice carried something unmistakable. Authority, calm, and a mercy deeper than anything the thief had ever known. Jesus said, "Truly I tell you." Those words alone already carried weight. Whenever Jesus said, "Truly I tell you," it meant something important was about to follow. Something certain. Something that would not change. The thief held his breath. Then came the words that would echo through eternity. "Today, you will be with me in paradise." The criminal's heart stopped for a moment. Today? Not someday. Not after years of proving himself. Not after making up for all his crimes. Today. The promise was immediate. And the promise was personal. You will be with me. Not just in paradise, but with Jesus. For the first time in his life, the thief realized something unbelievable. Grace was not earned. Grace was given. He had no time left to fix his past. No chance to perform good works. No opportunity to prove he deserved forgiveness. All he had done was believe. And that belief changed everything. The crowd did not understand what had just happened. To them, it looked like two dying men exchanging final words. But heaven saw something completely different. A soul was being rescued at the very last moment. Angels witnessed a miracle that would confuse religious minds for centuries. Because the thief had done nothing religious. He had never been baptized. He had never followed the law. He had never lived a righteous life. Yet in the final moments of his existence, he trusted Jesus. And that was enough. Meanwhile, the sky above Jerusalem continued to darken. The sun disappeared behind a strange, heavy darkness that spread across the land. People began whispering nervously. Something was wrong. Something cosmic was happening. The earth itself seemed to recognize the weight of the moment. The Son of God was dying, and beside him hung a man who had just been given a future he never imagined. The thief felt the pain in his body, but something inside him had changed. Fear began to fade. For the first time since the soldiers had nailed him to the cross, peace entered his heart. He was still dying, but he was no longer afraid, because death was no longer the end. Beyond the darkness, beyond the suffering, beyond the shame of his past, paradise was waiting, and Jesus himself had promised it. No one in the crowd realized the power of that moment. They saw a criminal, but heaven saw a redeemed man, and history would remember him forever as the thief who entered paradise in his final hour. The darkness over the land grew heavier. It was not like an ordinary shadow from clouds passing across the sky. This darkness felt unnatural, almost alive. It spread across Jerusalem as if the entire world had paused to witness what was happening on that hill called Golgotha. People in the crowd began whispering nervously. Some of them had come to mock. Some had come only out of curiosity. Others stood there in silence, unable to explain why they felt uneasy watching this execution. 3 crosses stood against the darkening sky. On the center cross hung Jesus. On one side, the criminal who had mocked him earlier now remained silent, his bitterness slowly fading as the reality of death approached. On the other side hung the thief who had just received a promise that would change his eternity. His body still burned with pain. Every breath felt like pulling air through broken glass. But something inside him had shifted. A strange peace had begun to settle over his heart. Moments earlier, he had been certain that death meant the end. Now, he knew something different waited beyond it. Paradise. And even more importantly, Jesus had said, "You will be with me." The thief began replaying those words in his mind again and again. Not tomorrow. Not after judgment. Today. For a man who had spent his entire life being rejected, hated, and feared, those words meant everything. For the first time in his life, someone holy had spoken to him not with anger, but with mercy. He looked again toward Jesus. The man beside him was suffering more than anyone on that hill. The crown of thorns pressed deeply into his head. Blood ran down his face and neck. His back, torn apart from the Roman scourging, rubbed painfully against the rough wood of the cross each time he struggled to breathe. And yet, there was something different about him. Most men who were crucified cursed, screamed, and begged the soldiers for mercy. But Jesus had done none of those things. Instead, earlier he had prayed for the very men who nailed him there. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." The thief had heard those words. He had never forgotten them. What kind of man prays for his executioners? What kind of man promises paradise to a criminal in his final moments? The thief began to realize something slowly. The man beside him was not just a teacher, not just a prophet. He truly was a king, but not the kind of king the world expected. This king ruled with mercy. This king saved the broken. This king welcomed the unworthy. The soldiers below continued their work without emotion. To them, crucifixion was routine. They gambled for Jesus' clothing, laughing as they threw dice at the foot of the cross. Religious leaders stood nearby, still shaking their heads. See, they mocked. He saved others, but he cannot save himself. But they did not understand. Jesus was not refusing to save himself because he was powerless. He was choosing not to. Every moment he remained on that cross was a choice. A choice to carry the weight of humanity's sin. A choice to complete the mission he had come to fulfill. The thief did not fully understand theology. He did not know the prophecies. He had not studied the scriptures. But somehow, deep in his heart, he knew this moment was bigger than anyone there realized. The man dying beside him was changing the fate of the world. Time passed slowly. The darkness remained heavy over the land. Some in the crowd had already begun leaving, disturbed by the strange atmosphere surrounding the crucifixion. But the thief stayed focused on the man in the center. His breathing became weaker. His strength slowly faded. But instead of fear filling his mind, hope replaced it. All his life, people had defined him by his crimes. Thief, outcast, criminal, condemned. But Jesus had spoken a different future over him. Paradise. For the first time since the nails pierced his hands, the thief allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment. Not in despair, but in quiet anticipation. Because when death came, he believed he would open his eyes again somewhere else. Not in darkness, not in judgment, but in a place where mercy had the final word. And waiting there would be the same voice that had spoken to him on the cross. Today you will be with me in paradise. The darkness still covered the land. Hours had passed since the crosses were raised on the hill of Golgotha, yet time now felt heavy, slow, almost suspended. The air carried a strange silence. Even the crowd that once shouted insults had grown quieter. Some had already left, uneasy about what they were witnessing. Others remained, watching with a mixture of confusion, anger, and fear. On the crosses, the three men were nearing the end. Crucifixion was designed to drain life slowly. Each breath required pushing up against nails driven through flesh. Each movement tore wounds deeper. Every moment was agony. But the thief who had spoken to Jesus earlier was no longer thinking about the pain. His body still suffered. His lungs struggled for air. But his heart had found something stronger than fear. Hope. He replayed Jesus' promise again and again in his mind. Today you will be with me in paradise. No priest had ever spoken words like that to him. No rabbi had ever looked at him with anything but judgment. All his life he had been pushed aside, labeled rejected. Yet in the final moments of his life, the Son of God had looked directly at him and offered mercy. Not probation, not punishment first, but paradise. Below the crosses, the Roman soldiers continued their duties. They had seen many executions. To them, death was simply another day's work. Yet even some of them began to feel uneasy. The darkness covering the sky was unnatural. The ground beneath their feet felt tense, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, a cry broke the silence. It came from the center cross. Jesus lifted his head, gathering what little strength remained in his body. His voice, though weak, carried across the hill. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And then he breathed his last. For a moment, everything went still. Then the earth shook. The ground beneath Golgotha trembled violently. Rocks cracked. Dust rose into the air. The people standing nearby cried out in fear. Some fell to their knees. Others ran down the hill in panic. Even the Roman centurion overseeing the execution stared at Jesus in shock. He had watched countless men die, but never like this. Looking up at the lifeless body on the cross, he spoke words that would echo through history. Surely this man was the Son of God. Meanwhile, the thief hanging beside Jesus felt his own strength fading quickly. His breaths became shallow. The world around him began to blur. But something inside him remained calm. Because the fear that once gripped his soul was gone. He had spent his life running from judgment, stealing, hiding, surviving however he could. But now, there was nothing left to run from. Jesus had already spoken his future. Paradise. The thief slowly turned his head one last time toward the man who had changed everything for him. The sky was still dark. The crowd was scattered. The soldiers were shouting in confusion after the earthquake. But none of that mattered anymore. Because the most important words had already been spoken. His eyes slowly closed. The pain of the cross faded. The weight of guilt that had followed him his entire life was finally gone. The criminal who had once been condemned by the world was about to step into eternity forgiven. And just as Jesus had promised, death would not be the end of his story. The hill of Golgotha slowly emptied. Dust settled back onto the ground where the crowd had stood only moments before. The shouting had stopped. The accusations had faded. Even the soldiers began preparing to leave, believing the story had ended. 3 crosses still stood against the darkened sky. 3 men had been condemned that day, but only one of them died with hope. The criminal who had once cursed Jesus now hung silent. His story had ended the way he had chosen, with bitterness still clinging to his heart. But the other thief, the one who had spoken those few desperate words, had stepped into eternity differently. Not because he had lived a righteous life. Not because he had followed every command. Not because he had time to make things right. He had no time left to fix his past. No time to repay the people he had hurt. No time to prove himself worthy. All he had was a moment. A single moment of honesty. A moment where pride finally broke. A moment where he stopped defending himself and simply said, "Jesus, remember me." And that moment changed everything. The story of the thief on the cross reveals something powerful about grace. Grace does not wait for perfection. Grace does not demand a long history of good behavior. Grace arrives the moment a heart turns toward God. That criminal had nothing to offer. No money, no reputation, no future. Yet heaven opened for him anyway. Because salvation was never about what he could bring. It was always about who Jesus was. While the religious leaders believed they had defeated a criminal teacher, while the crowd believed justice had been served, something far greater had taken place on that hill. A door had opened. A door wide enough for the worst sinner. A door wide enough for the forgotten. A door wide enough for anyone willing to call on the name of Jesus. And that door has never closed. Many people believe they must fix themselves before coming to God. They believe they must clean their lives first. Become better. Become worthy. Become someone different. But the thief on the cross proves the opposite. He came exactly as he was. Broken. Guilty. Out of time. And Jesus received him. That means something incredible for us today. No matter how far someone has fallen. No matter how many mistakes have been made. No matter how many labels the world has placed on them. Grace still calls their name. Because the same Savior who looked at a dying criminal and said, "Today you will be with me in paradise," is still speaking to hearts today. The cross was never just about punishment. It was about rescue. Jesus did not come to celebrate the perfect. He came to seek the lost. The thief discovered that truth in the final hours of his life. But we are given something he never had. Time. Time to turn. Time to listen. Time to respond. And so the story leaves us with a question that echoes through every generation. If a condemned criminal could find mercy in his final breath, what might happen if we respond to Jesus today? Because the promise that changed the thief's eternity is still alive. Grace is still reaching. Mercy is still calling. And the door to paradise is still open.